The Kansas prairies stretched endlessly under a merciless August sun, tall grass bending in hot wind that offered no relief from the heat. Grace Turner rode her wagon along the rutted trail leading from Millbrook to her small homestead 5 miles outside town, her mind occupied with the 100 tasks waiting at home: garden weeding, fence mending, preparing preserves from the few vegetables her struggling garden had produced. At 23, Grace had lived alone for 2 years since her ad guide, surviving on stubbornness and the small income from selling eggs and doing mending work for town families. Movement in the distance caught her eye. Dark shapes circling in the sky. Vultures. Grace's stomach tightened. Those birds meant death or near death, and out here on the isolated prairie, that could mean anything from a fallen animal to a traveler in trouble. Her conscience warred with her caution. She was a lone woman with limited resources, and the smart thing would be to keep driving home. But Grace had never been particularly good at doing the smart thing when someone might need help. She urged her horse toward the circling birds, approaching a slight depression where the prairie grass grew thicker. What she found made her gasp and pull the wagon to an abrupt stop. A man lay motionless in the grass, his shirt dark with dried blood, his face swollen and bruised almost beyond recognition. Flies buzzed around him, and the vultures overhead grew bolder, descending in lower circles. Grace's first instinct was that he was already dead, but then she saw the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. Grace climbed down from the wagon, approaching cautiously. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair matted with blood and dirt. His clothes, though now filthy and torn, had once been of decent quality, not a drifter or vagrant then, but someone who'd had means. But what struck Grace most was the deliberate nature of his injuries and abandonment. This wasn't an accident or random attack. Someone had beaten this man severely and left him here to die, far enough from town that discovery would be unlikely. She knelt beside him, checking for signs of life more carefully. His pulse was weak and irregular, his breathing shallow. He had multiple injuries: a gash on his head, bruised ribs, possibly broken, and what looked like a knife wound in his side that had bled considerably. Without treatment, he would certainly die within hours. Grace made a quick decision. She couldn't lift him alone, but she could bring water and try to revive him enough to help him into the wagon. It would be difficult, possibly dangerous, but leaving him here to die wasn't something her conscience could accept. Grace retrieved her water flask and a clean cloth from the wagon. She carefully cleaned the blood from his face and dribbled water onto his cracked lips. The man stirred slightly, a low groan escaping. "Can you hear me?" Grace asked, keeping her voice calm. "You're badly hurt. I want to help, but I need you to try to wake up." She continued talking, administering water drop by drop, until the man's eyes finally flickered open, dark brown eyes that held confusion and pain. "Where?" He tried to speak, his voice a raspy whisper. "Easy," Grace soothed. "You're safe. I found you out on the prairie. You've been badly injured. Do you remember what happened?" The man's eyes closed again, whether from pain or the effort of consciousness, Grace couldn't tell. But he'd been aware enough to respond, which meant there was hope. "I need to get you to my wagon. It's going to hurt, but you'll die if we stay here. Can you try to help me?" Over the next 30 agonizing minutes, Grace managed to half-carry, half-drag the wounded man to her wagon. He helped as much as his broken body allowed, but the effort cost him tremendously. By the time Grace had him lying in the wagon bed on blankets she had spread, he'd lost consciousness again. She drove toward home as quickly as she dared, every bump and jolt potentially worsening his injuries, but speed was necessary. He'd lost significant blood and needed immediate care. Grace's homestead was modest, a small sod house her uncle had built, a barn, chicken coop, and vegetable garden surrounded by endless prairie. She maneuvered the wagon close to the house and faced the challenge of getting the unconscious man inside. Through sheer determination and improvised techniques involving ropes and sliding him on blankets, she finally succeeded in moving him onto her bed, the only proper bed in the house. She'd sleep on the floor or in the chair. Right now, keeping this stranger alive mattered more than her comfort. As Grace cut away his bloody shirt to properly assess his wounds, she noticed something that made her pause. Old scars crisscrossing his back and torso, marks that spoke of a hard, violent past. Whatever this man's story, it hadn't been an easy one. But Grace pushed speculation aside and focused on immediate needs.
She cleaned the wounds with water she'd boiled, applied poultices her aunt had taught her to make from herbs, and bound his ribs as tightly as she could manage. The head wound worried her most. He could have damage she couldn't see or treat. Night fell as Grace finished her nursing work. The stranger remained unconscious, his breathing slightly more stable but still concerning. Grace sat in her chair beside the bed, exhausted but unable to rest. She'd saved this man's life, or at least given him a chance at life. But questions crowded her mind. Who was he? What had he done to inspire such brutal retribution? And what would happen when town discovered she'd brought him to her home? Grace had a feeling that come morning, her life was about to become much more complicated. But she'd made her choice, guided by the simple belief that every life had value regardless of past mistakes. Now she'd live with whatever consequences followed.
The story spread through Millbrook within an hour. By the time Grace had gathered her supplies, purchased with Mrs. Henderson's obvious reluctance, a small crowd had gathered outside the store. Marshal Tom Bradley pushed through, his weathered face stern. "Miss Turner, I need to speak with you." Grace faced him steadily despite her racing heart. "Marshal." Bradley's voice was firm, but not unkind. "You brought Cole Brennan to your homestead. That man is wanted for murder. You're harboring a criminal." "I'm caring for a dying man," Grace corrected. "When I found him, I didn't know who he was or what he'd done. I just knew someone needed help." Marshal Bradley sighed heavily. "Grace, I understand your compassion, but Brennan is dangerous. He's killed before. Patterson wasn't his first. He's drifted through 3 territories, leaving trouble behind. The decent thing would be to let him face justice, which is what would have happened if he hadn't tried to run." Grace felt the crowd's hostility, saw the hardness in faces she'd known for years. Justice isn't leaving someone to die in the prairie, Marshal. If he's guilty, let the courts decide. But I won't have his death on my conscience when I could have helped. A man in the crowd shouted, "You're a fool, girl. That man's got no soul. He'll kill you first chance he gets." Others murmured agreement, and Grace realized with sinking dread that she'd become an outcast by saving Cole Brennan. Marshal Bradley made a decision. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll care for Brennan until he's stable enough to be moved. Then I'm taking him into custody to face proper trial. Until then, I'll post a deputy at your place to ensure he doesn't escape, and to protect you if he regains strength and turns violent. You've put yourself in danger, Grace, even if your intentions were good." Grace nodded, accepting the compromise. At least Brennan would receive medical care and a chance at a fair trial rather than death by exposure. The ride home was lonely, Grace's mind churning with what she'd learned. Cole Brennan was a killer. The man lying unconscious in her bed had taken lives, caused pain, inspired such hatred that people had been willing to leave him for the vultures. Part of Grace questioned her decision. Had she saved someone who didn't deserve saving? But another part, the part shaped by her aunt's teachings about mercy and redemption, insisted that every person deserved basic human dignity, regardless of their past. Deputy Jim Warren arrived that afternoon, a young man clearly uncomfortable with the assignment. "Miss Turner, I'm to stay in your barn, keep watch on the prisoner. Marshal's orders." Grace showed him the barn and provided blankets, then returned to her nursing duties. Cole Brennan remained unconscious through the day, though he occasionally muttered incomprehensible words that might have been fever dreams or fragmented memories. Grace found herself studying his face, trying to see the killer everyone described. She saw only a sick, wounded man who looked more broken than dangerous. That night, as Grace sat beside the bed doing mending work by lamplight, Brennan's eyes suddenly opened fully for the first time. He looked around with confusion before his gaze settled on Grace. "Where?" His voice was rough and weak. "You're at my homestead," Grace explained quietly. "I found you on the prairie 3 days ago. You were badly injured." Recognition and something like despair filled Brennan's eyes. "You should have left me, would have been better." His words were barely whispered, but the pain in them went beyond physical suffering. "No one deserves to die alone like that," Grace said simply. Brennan's laugh was bitter and short, cut off by obvious pain. "You don't know what I've done, what I am." Grace met his eyes steadily. "I know what people say. I know you're accused of murder, but I also know that leaving you to die would have made me complicit in something I couldn't live with. So, here we are." Brennan stared at her for a long moment, something like confusion mixing with the pain in his expression, as if kindness was a language he no longer understood. "Why?" he finally asked. Grace considered her answer carefully. "Because I was taught that mercy matters, even when, especially when, it's difficult. Because I believe people are more than their worst moments, and because," she paused, "because I know what it's like to be alone and hopeless. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." Brennan's eyes closed, but not before Grace saw something glisten in them that might have been tears. "You're a fool," he whispered, but there was no malice in it, only exhaustion and something that might have been gratitude. Grace let him sleep, but the brief conversation had shifted something in her understanding. Whatever Cole Brennan had done, he wasn't the heartless monster the town described. He was a man carrying tremendous pain, one who'd expected death and found instead an unexpected mercy he clearly felt he didn't deserve. Grace didn't know if Brennan could be redeemed or what his true story was, but she knew that her decision to save him had been right, regardless of consequences. Sometimes compassion wasn't about deserving. It was about remaining human in a world that made hardness seem like wisdom. And Grace intended to stay human, whatever it cost her. Over the following week, Cole Brennan slowly regained strength under Grace's careful nursing. The head wound healed without signs of serious brain damage, his ribs began mending, and the knife wound closed properly. Physically, he was recovering. But Grace noticed something more troubling. Brennan remained emotionally distant, speaking only when necessary, answering her questions with minimal words, his expression carefully neutral, as if he'd built walls so thick that kindness couldn't penetrate them. Deputy Warren maintained his watch from the barn, checking on Brennan twice a day, but mostly leaving Grace to her nursing duties. Deputy Warren clearly saw Brennan as a dangerous criminal to be guarded, not a patient to be cared for. Townspeople had stopped visiting Grace entirely. Her compassion for a killer had made her an outcast. Mrs. Henderson barely spoke when Grace came to town for supplies, and former acquaintances crossed the street to avoid her. Grace felt the loneliness keenly, but refused to regret her choice. One afternoon, while changing Brennan's bandages, Grace asked a question that had been on her mind. "Will you tell me what happened the night you shot James Patterson?" Her jaw tightened. "Why? Want to hear the killer's excuse?" Her tone was harsh, defensive. Grace continued her work calmly. "I want to hear your truth. Everyone else has told me their version, but I haven't heard yours." Brennan was quiet for so long Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. Patterson and 3 others had been cheating at cards for weeks. Everyone knew it, but they were protected. Patterson's brother was wealthy, influential. I called them out on it that night, showed proof of how they were marking cards. Patterson got angry, reached for his gun. I was faster. Brennan's voice was flat, emotionless, but Grace heard the underlying pain. "Self-defense?" she asked. He shook his head slightly. "Maybe, maybe not. I didn't have to draw. I could have walked away, but I was angry, at them, at a world where men like that always win because they have money and connections. So I drew, and I shot, and I killed Patterson." Grace absorbed this, understanding it was more complicated than the town's simple narrative of cold-blooded murder. "You didn't shoot him in the back, didn't ambush him?" Brennan's eyes met hers. "No, it was a fair draw, if such a thing exists. But fair doesn't matter when the man you kill has powerful friends. The town decided I was a murderer, and they were probably right to. I've done plenty to deserve that label, even if not for this particular killing." His voice carried such profound self-hatred that Grace felt her heart contract with unexpected sympathy. "What do you mean you've done plenty to deserve it?" Grace asked gently. He turned his face away. "I've been drifting for 10 years, Miss Turner, getting into trouble, making bad choices, hurting people. I've fought in range wars, hired my gun to whoever paid, lived like there was nothing good left in the world worth protecting. Maybe there isn't. Maybe I was right all along." The bleakness in his voice was absolute, and Grace recognized it. The same hopelessness she'd felt after her parents died, after her aunt passed, when it seemed the world was nothing but suffering and loss. But Grace had found reasons to keep going, small as they were. "There's always something worth protecting," she said firmly. "The morning sunrise, the first green shoots in spring, the satisfaction of honest work, kindness from a stranger." Brennan laughed bitterly and short, cut off by obvious pain. "You're describing a world I stopped seeing years ago, Miss Turner. If it exists, it's not for people like me." Grace felt frustration rise. "It exists for everyone. You just have to choose to see it,
to let yourself feel something other than anger and pain. Easy for you to say, Brennan shot back with sudden heat. You're innocent. You haven't done the things I've done, seen what I've seen. Your hands are clean. Grace's response was sharp. My hands are clean. My parents died when I was 15 in a cholera outbreak I survived. I watched them suffer, unable to help. My aunt took me in, then died 2 years ago, leaving me alone to manage a failing homestead in territory that barely tolerates single women. I've gone to bed hungry, more nights than I can count. I've been cheated, dismissed, and treated like I don't matter. So don't tell me about suffering, Mr. Brennan. I know it well. Her words hung in the air, surprising them both with their vehemence. Brennan stared at her, seeing her, truly seeing her, for perhaps the first time. Not just the kind woman who'd saved him, but a real person with real struggles, someone who'd faced hardship and chosen to remain compassionate despite it. I'm sorry, he said quietly, and Grace heard genuine remorse. You're right, I've been so wrapped up in my own darkness I couldn't see that everyone carries pain. The difference is, you didn't let it turn you cold. I came close, Grace admitted, her anger fading. After my aunt died, I almost did. It would have been easier to just stop caring, stop trying, stop hoping, but that felt like letting the world win, like giving up on the possibility that things could be better. So I chose differently. Every day I choose differently. It's not easy, but it's possible. Brennan studied her face with an intensity that made Grace self-conscious. How? He asked simply. How do you choose hope when everything tells you it's pointless? Grace considered her answer carefully. I think you start small. You find one good thing, even tiny, and hold on to it.
2 weeks after Grace found him, Cole Brennan was strong enough to stand trial. Marshal Bradley arrived with a wagon to transport him to the county seat, 30 miles away, where a circuit judge would hear his case. Grace had mixed feelings as she watched Brennan being handcuffed, relief that he'd recovered enough to face proper justice, but anxiety about what that justice might entail. Brennan's face was carefully neutral as the marshal led him to the wagon, but his eyes found Grace's before he climbed in. Thank you, Brennan said quietly, for everything. Grace nodded, finding her throat tight with unexpected emotion. I hope things turn out fairly for you. Marshal Bradley gave her a long look. You planning to testify, Miss Turner, as to his character and condition when you found him? Grace hadn't considered this, but the question demanded an answer. If it would help ensure a fair hearing, yes, I'll testify. The marshal nodded approvingly. Good. Judge Morrison appreciates hearing from witnesses. He'll send word when the trial's set. The summons came 3 days later. The trial would be held the following week. Grace made the journey to the county seat in her wagon, staying at a modest boarding house and feeling out of place in the larger town. The courthouse was packed with spectators, many from Millbrook who'd come to see Cole Brennan face justice. Grace felt hostile stares as she took her seat, clearly marked as the foolish woman who'd saved a killer. The prosecution presented its case efficiently. Multiple witnesses described the argument in the saloon, the card game, Patterson's accusation of cheating directed at another player, Brennan's defense of that player and presentation of marked cards as evidence, Patterson's angry response and reach for his weapon, and Brennan's faster draw that ended with Patterson dead. The prosecution argued this was murder. Brennan had provoked the confrontation and killed a man over a card game. The penalty sought was hanging. Brennan's defense attorney, a young man doing court-appointed work with limited enthusiasm, presented a weaker case. Self-defense, Patterson drew first, Brennan was protecting himself. But he provided no character witnesses, no context about Brennan's life, nothing to humanize the defendant. When the defense rested after barely an hour, the judge looked dissatisfied. Is that all? No witnesses to character? No testimony about the defendant beyond this single incident? The attorney shook his head. The defendant has no family, Your Honor, no friends to speak on his behalf. Judge Morrison, a stern-faced man in his 60s, looked at his paperwork. I have a request here from a Miss Grace Turner to provide testimony. Is she present? Grace stood, her heart pounding. Yes, Your Honor. The judge gestured forward. Approach the witness stand. I want to hear what you have to say. Grace was sworn in, acutely aware of Brennan's eyes on her, of the crowd's skeptical attention, of the weight of her words on a man's life. The judge's questions were direct. "Miss Turner, you found the defendant after he'd been left for dead, correct?" Grace confirmed. "Describe his condition." Grace detailed the severe injuries, the hours away from death, the vulnerable state Brennan had been in. "During his recovery at your home, did he threaten you, show violence?" Grace shook her head firmly. "No, Your Honor. He was cooperative, respectful, and never once gave me cause for fear, despite his reputation." "Why did you save him?" the judge asked. "You knew who he was, knew what he was accused of." Grace took a breath. "When I found him, I didn't know. I just saw someone dying who needed help. When I learned who he was later, people said I should regret helping him, that he didn't deserve mercy. But I couldn't agree with that. Whatever he'd done, leaving someone to die of exposure seemed like giving up on the possibility that people can change, that justice should be about fairness, not revenge." The courtroom was silent as Grace continued. "During his recovery, I talked with Mr. Brennan extensively. I learned about the circumstances of the shooting, that he was defending against cheaters, that Patterson drew first, that it wasn't the cold-blooded murder people claim. But I also learned about his past, about years of anger and poor choices he readily admits to. He's not innocent of wrongdoing, but he's also not the heartless killer people believe. He's a man who lost his way and made bad decisions, but who still has capacity for change." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "You believe he can be redeemed?" Grace met the judge's eyes steadily. "I believe everyone has that capacity, Your Honor. Whether they choose it is up to them. But I think denying them the chance is wrong. Mr. Brennan defended himself against a man who drew first. That's not murder. That's survival. If he's punished with death for surviving, what message does that send about justice?" Her words rang through the courtroom, and Grace saw several jury members nodding thoughtfully. The prosecution cross-examined, trying to paint Grace as a naive woman seduced by a charming criminal. But Grace held firm, her testimony clear and unshakable. Brennan had acted in self-defense, had shown remorse for his past, and deserved a chance at redemption rather than execution. When she stepped down, she caught Brennan's expression, raw emotion breaking through his careful control, something between gratitude and disbelief that anyone would speak for him so passionately. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. "We find the defendant guilty of manslaughter in self-defense, not murder." The judge sentenced Brennan to 3 years in territorial prison. Time to serve, time to reflect, but not death. The courtroom erupted in protests from those who'd wanted hanging, but the judge gavelled for silence. "Justice has been served. This court is adjourned." Grace felt weak with relief. Brennan would live. He'd face consequences for his actions, but he'd have a chance to build a different future afterwards. As the marshal led him away, Brennan looked back at Grace one last time. She couldn't read all the emotions in his expression, but she saw gratitude clearly, and something else, a tiny spark of the hope she'd tried to kindle. 3 years would pass, life would continue, but Grace had helped save more than just Brennan's life. She'd helped save the possibility that he could become someone different, someone better, and that was worth all the hostility she'd faced, all the loneliness, all the struggle. Sometimes, one person's compassion can change the course of another's life. Grace had proven that truth, and she'd carry it with her, always. Grace stood in her garden on a warm spring morning, examining the healthy green shoots emerging from soil she'd worked tirelessly to improve. 3 years had transformed her homestead from barely surviving to genuinely thriving. The chickens were numerous and productive, her vegetable garden flourished with proper care, and she'd even acquired 2 milk cows, whose dairy products she sold in town. The work was still hard, but Grace had built something sustainable, something to be proud of. Her relationship with Millbrook had slowly improved over the years. Initial hostility had faded as people recognized that Grace's compassion for Cole Brennan hadn't made her dangerous or foolish. She'd simply held to her principles when tested. Some townspeople still kept their distance, but others had come to respect her quiet strength and independence. Mrs. Henderson now greeted her warmly, often adding an extra item to her purchases because you could use it. Small gestures, but meaningful. Grace hadn't seen or heard from Cole Brennan since the trial. She assumed he was serving his sentence somewhere in territorial prison, and she tried not to think too much about what would happen when those 3 years ended. Would he return to his old ways? Or would prison time and her intervention have lasting impact? She'd done what she could. The rest was up to him. Still, she sometimes found herself wondering, hoping he was all right, hoping her faith in his capacity for change hadn't been misplaced. On this particular morning, Grace was in her garden when she heard a horse approaching. Visitors were still relatively rare, so she stood, shading her eyes to see who was coming. A man on a dark horse rode slowly up the path to our homestead, and as he drew closer, Grace's heart began beating faster. She recognized something in the rider's build, his posture, though he looked different than she remembered. Healthier, less gaunt, his face open rather than guarded. Cole Brennan dismounted about 20 feet from where Grace stood, his movements careful, as if approaching a skittish animal. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered, but carrying warmth that hadn't been there 3 years ago. "I hope I'm not intruding." Grace found her voice, though it came out breathless. "Mr. Brennan? I didn't expect to see you." He smiled slightly, that same transformative smile she'd glimpsed once during his recovery, but now it seemed more natural, less like breaking through ice.
"I should have written," Brennan admitted, "but I didn't know what to say. How do you thank someone for saving your life and your soul in the same action?" Grace felt warmth rise in her cheeks. "I only did what seemed right." Brennan shook his head. "No, you did something remarkable. You showed mercy to someone everyone else had written off as worthless. Do you know what that meant? What it still means?" His voice carried such intensity that Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Brennan took a tentative step closer. "Those 3 years in prison, I had a lot of time to think about my life, my choices, the man I'd become, and I kept coming back to you, to the way you insisted I could be more than my worst moments, that hope wasn't foolish, that small good things mattered. I didn't believe you then, but I thought about what you said every single day, and slowly I started trying." He paused, gathering words. "I learned to read better, helped other inmates who couldn't read at all, worked in the prison garden and found peace in growing things. Small things like you said. They added up." Grace listened, her heart full of emotions she couldn't name. "I'm glad," she managed. "I'm so glad you found something positive in that experience." Brennan's expression grew more serious. "Grace. May I call you Grace? Miss Turner feels too formal for what I need to say." She nodded permission, and he continued. "I came here today because I wanted you to know that I'm different now. Not perfect. I'll never be perfect. But I'm not the angry, hopeless man you saved. I have a job lined up at a ranch 30 miles from here. Honest work, fresh start. But before I began that new life, I needed to see you, to thank you properly, and to ask—" He trailed off, and Grace prompted gently, "Ask what?" Brennan met her eyes, and Grace saw vulnerability there that took her breath away. "To ask if you'd let me call on you sometimes, to visit, to talk, to see if what I feel for you might be something you could feel too, given time." Grace's surprise must have shown, because Brennan quickly added, "I know that sounds insane. I'm an ex-convict with a reputation. You're a respectable woman who's built a good life. You deserve better than me. But these 3 years, you've been the light I aimed toward. And I thought, maybe, if there was any chance." Grace realized she was crying, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Relief? Joy? Fear? Perhaps all three. "Cole," she said, using his first name deliberately, "I need you to understand something. When I saved you, I wasn't expecting anything in return. I don't require gratitude or anything else. You don't owe me."
Brennan stepped closer still, now just a few feet away. I know I don't owe you. That's exactly why I want this. Not obligation, but choice. I'm choosing to be here, to ask if you'd give me a chance to prove I'm worth your time. Grace studied his face, seeing sincerity and hope warring with fear of rejection. She thought about the past 3 years of loneliness, of the connection she'd felt during those weeks of nursing him, of the way his recovery had given her purpose beyond mere survival. She thought about how she'd wondered about him, hoped for him, carried him in her thoughts, even when she told herself she shouldn't, and she realized that somewhere along the way, compassion had transformed into something deeper. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. Yes, Grace said simply, you can call on me. We'll see where it leads. The transformation in Brennan's expression, from fearful hope to pure joy, was beautiful to witness. He laughed, the sound genuine and free in a way Grace had never heard from him. Thank you. I promise I'll prove worthy of this chance. I'll work hard, live right, show you that your faith wasn't misplaced. Grace smiled. I already know it wasn't misplaced, Cole. Your being here, the man you've become, that's proof enough. They talked for hours that day, sitting on Grace's porch as afternoon faded to evening. Cole told her about prison life, the struggles and small victories, the men he'd helped and those who'd helped him. Grace shared stories of her 3 years, the challenges of running the homestead alone, the slow rebuilding of community relationships, the satisfaction of watching her garden flourish. They laughed together, grieved together, and began building the foundation of something neither had expected, but both recognized as precious. As the sun set, painting the Kansas prairie in brilliant oranges and purples, Cole prepared to leave for his new job. I'll visit every Sunday if that's all right. It's my day off. Grace agreed happily. He mounted his horse, then paused, looking down at her with an expression of such tenderness it made her chest tight. Grace, you gave me back my humanity when I lost it completely. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that gift. Grace reached up and briefly touched his hand. You already do, Cole. You already do. She watched him ride away into the twilight, then turned back to her homestead, her chickens settling for the night, her garden growing strong, her small house warm and welcoming. Grace had started with so little, orphaned, alone, struggling to survive. She saved a dying man not for reward, but because mercy mattered. And in doing so, she had saved herself too, proving that compassion wasn't weakness, but the strongest force in the world. A hated stranger left to vultures had found redemption through an orphan's heart. And that orphan had found that sometimes the love you give away returns to you multiplied, transformed into something more beautiful than you ever imagined. The ice had melted, the walls had fallen, and what remained was 2 people choosing hope, choosing each other, choosing the possibility that even the most broken things can be made whole again through patience, kindness, and stubborn faith in the human capacity for change.